Donald Trump made a promise. He looked directly into the camera, directly at the American people, and he said, "I am going to bring manufacturing back. I am going to protect American industry. I am going to make sure other countries stop taking advantage of us. And tariffs are how we do it." It sounded strong. It sounded simple. It sounded like the kind of decisive action that people who felt left behind by the global economy had been waiting decades to hear. And then he imposed tariffs on Canadian lumber. And American home builders started paying $9,200 more per house. $9,200 per house. Not per neighborhood. Not per development. Per single-family home. Let that number sit with you for a moment. Because that number is not a talking point. It is not an estimate from a think tank with an agenda. It is a figure released by the National Association of Home Builders, the organization that represents the companies actually constructing homes across the United States. The people who build the houses that American families live in. And they are saying, clearly and on the record, that Trump's tariffs are adding over $9,000 to the cost of building every single home in America. The tariffs did not bring back American jobs. They did not rebuild American industry. They did not level any playing field. They made American homes unaffordable. And the reason, the specific, structural, unavoidable reason, is something that the politicians who designed this policy either did not understand or chose to ignore. 85% of the softwood lumber used in American construction comes from Canada. Not 20%. Not 50%. 85%. There is no American lumber industry that can replace that supply. It does not exist. And no tariff on earth can make it exist overnight. In the next 25 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how this happened, why it was predictable, who is paying the price, and what it reveals about the gap between tariff promises and economic reality. If you are not already subscribed to Inside Canada, hit that subscribe button right now and hit the like button before we go any further. Because what I am about to show you is something that almost no one is explaining clearly, and you deserve the full picture. Let's go. Before we can understand what the tariffs did, we need to understand the market they hit. Because the lumber market has a structure that makes it almost uniquely vulnerable to exactly the kind of disruption that tariffs create. Here is the basic picture. The United States consumes roughly 50 billion board feet of softwood lumber every single year. 50 billion. That is an enormous volume, the raw material for millions of homes, millions of construction projects, millions of American families trying to build or renovate or expand their living spaces. American domestic production provides approximately 30 billion board feet of that total, which sounds significant until you do the math. 30 billion out of 50 billion means domestic production covers 60% of demand. That leaves a 20 billion board foot gap. 20 billion board feet that has to come from somewhere. And Canada fills that gap. Canadian mills, concentrated in British Columbia, Alberta, and other provinces, have the forest resources, the processing capacity, and the logistics networks to deliver that lumber to American markets. They have built entire industries, entire communities, entire regional economies around supplying American demand. No other country comes close to matching Canadian scale, quality, and delivery speed. Not Germany. Not Sweden. Not Brazil. Not Chile. Not anyone. This is not an accident. It is the result of decades of investment, geographic proximity, and shared infrastructure. Canada is right there, across a border that trucks cross every day, across a border serviced by rail networks that have been moving lumber south for over a century. So when Trump imposed tariffs on lumber imports, he was not hitting a diffuse global market where American buyers could easily find alternatives. He was hitting the single dominant supplier of a product that American construction cannot function without. And he was doing it in a market where no realistic alternative exists at the scale required. But there is a layer to this story that goes even deeper than volume. The dependence on Canadian lumber is not just about quantity. It is also about the specific technical properties of the wood itself. And this is the part that almost nobody explains when they talk about lumber tariffs, because it requires understanding how construction actually works. American lumber production is concentrated in two main regions. The Southeast produces the most domestic lumber, primarily from pine plantations in states like Georgia, Alabama, the Carolinas. It is a significant industry. But southern pine has different structural properties than the species Canadian mills process. Different strength ratings. Different stiffness characteristics. Different dimensional behavior when it gets wet or dries out. Construction applications are not interchangeable. Load-bearing walls need wood that meet specific strength ratings. Roof trusses require particular dimensional tolerances. Floor joists demand specific stiffness measurements to meet building codes. When an engineer designs a structure and specifies Douglas fir or spruce, species that Canadian mills produce, you cannot simply substitute southern pine and expect the same performance. The codes will not allow it. The engineers will not certify it. The building will not perform the same way. The Pacific Northwest, Oregon and Washington, historically produced significant volumes of exactly the species that construction requires. The same Douglas fir and spruce that grow in British Columbia grow in those American states. But here is what happened. Decades of environmental restrictions. Spotted owl protections. Federal forest access limitations. Gradual, policy-driven reductions in northwestern timber production. Mills that closed because they could not access enough timber to remain viable. Workers who left the industry and found other careers. Infrastructure that deteriorated because without the mills, there was no reason to maintain it. This did not happen overnight. It happened over decades. And it happened as a direct result of policy choices. Choices that prioritized conservation and environmental protection over lumber production. Those choices can be debated. Reasonable people disagree about forest management and environmental policy. But here is what is not debatable. Tariffs cannot reverse decades of structural decline. Tariffs cannot reopen closed mills. Tariffs cannot replant forests that take decades to mature. Tariffs cannot rebuild a workforce that dispersed across other industries 20 years ago. If you want to rebuild American lumber production capacity in the Pacific Northwest, you are talking about a multi-decade investment program, changes to federal forest management policy, and billions of dollars in new mill construction. You are not talking about something that happens in response to a tariff proclamation. The supply gap exists because of policy choices made over decades. And tariffs cannot undo those choices. They can only make the existing supply more expensive. So knowing all of that, knowing the market structure, knowing the technical dependence, knowing the decades-long decline of Northwestern production, let us look at exactly what Trump did and how he justified it. On October 14, 2025, Trump imposed a 10% tariff on all softwood timber and lumber imports under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. Now, Section 232 is important to understand. It is not a standard trade protection mechanism. It is a national security provision. It allows the President of the United States to restrict imports that threaten national security. It was designed for situations where dependence on foreign suppliers creates genuine strategic vulnerability, the kind of vulnerability that could compromise America's ability to defend itself. The official justification stated that wood products are essential for defense infrastructure, military housing, missile defense systems. Therefore, reducing dependence on foreign lumber serves national security. Let me walk through why that justification collapses the moment you examine it. The proclamation acknowledged, correctly, that wood products are essential for defense infrastructure. That is true. The military builds things. Things require lumber. No argument there. The proclamation then acknowledged, also correctly, that domestic production cannot fully meet defense needs. Also true. America imports lumber because it needs more than it produces. And then the proclamation concluded that tariffs would address this threat. That conclusion is completely, demonstrably false. Tariffs do not increase domestic lumber production. Tariffs make imports more expensive. Those are two completely different things. If you want to increase domestic production, you invest in domestic production. You open federal forests to more logging. You fund mill construction. You train workers. You build infrastructure. Tariffs do none of that. Tariffs just add a cost to the imports that the market still needs. And here is the part that exposes the national security justification as something worse than just illogical. If the Pentagon needs wood for military construction, and it does, that would now costs more under the tariff, regardless of whether it comes from Canada or from a domestic supplier. The tariff does not distinguish between military and civilian applications. It applies to all lumber. So the tariff made defense construction more expensive. It did not strengthen national security. It weakened the Pentagon's purchasing power. The justification literally achieves the opposite of its stated goal. Now let us talk about where that $9,200 number actually comes from. Because it is not a round estimate. It is a calculated figure. And understanding the calculation helps you understand why tariffs on materials cause cascading economic damage that goes far beyond the initial price increase. The direct effect is straightforward. A 2x4 stud that cost $3 before tariffs now costs nearly $5 under combined tariff burdens. A 2x6 board jumps from $5 to over $7. Multiply those increases across the thousands of board feet required for a single-family home and you start to see significant numbers. But the $9,000 figure is not just the direct lumber cost increase. It includes the secondary and tertiary effects that ripple through the entire construction process. When lumber prices rise, contractors adjust their bids on projects. Every subcontractor who uses wood, framers, finish carpenters, cabinet installers, deck builders, recalculates their costs and increases their rates. Delays extend construction timelines because projects become financially uncertain, and extended timelines mean more financing costs. Carrying costs on construction loans compound. Project managers spend more time on cost management and less time on actual construction. Every one of these factors compounds on top of the direct lumber price increase. By the time you add them all together, the $9,000 figure reflects the full real-world impact on the cost of building a home. And it gets worse when you look at the existing tariff structure. Because the October 2025 Section 232 tariff did not land on a clean slate. It landed on top of a pile of duties that were already there. The United States has imposed countervailing duties and anti-dumping duties on Canadian softwood lumber for decades. These duties, imposed under the argument that Canadian provincial governments subsidize their lumber industries through favorable timber harvesting fees, have averaged between 14% and 25% depending on the specific Canadian producer and product category. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, the trade deal that was supposed to modernize and stabilize North American trade, does not eliminate these lumber duties. They persist as a legacy of a dispute that has been running for over 40 years. So here is where we stand today. The combined tariff burden on Canadian lumber now exceeds 35%. Some Canadian producers face total duties approaching 45% when you add the Section 232 tariffs to the highest existing countervailing and anti-dumping rates. 45%. On a product that American construction cannot function without. From a supplier that has no realistic substitute at scale. This is what happens when you layer new tariffs on top of old tariffs without asking why the old tariffs failed to solve the problem the first time, or the second time, or the third time. Now let me show you the full economic feedback loop. Because this is where the damage goes far beyond just higher home prices. This is where tariff policy that was sold as protecting American workers ends up destroying more American jobs than it creates. Follow the chain. Builders pay higher lumber costs. They have no choice. There is no substitute, there is no workaround, the lumber has to come from somewhere and Canada is the only source at the scale required. Builders pass those higher costs to buyers through higher home prices. They are businesses, not charities. They cannot absorb a $9,000 cost increase per unit and remain financially viable. Higher home prices reduce affordability. The families who were already stretching to qualify for a mortgage find themselves priced out. The first-time buyers who were saving for years to reach a down payment find the target moving away from them. Reduced affordability cuts demand. When fewer families can afford to buy, fewer homes get sold. When fewer homes get sold, fewer homes get built. When fewer homes get built, construction activity falls. Falling construction activity means job losses. Not in lumber mills, in the construction sector. Framers, roofers, electricians, plumbers, drywall installers, painters, landscapers, all the trades that depend on a steady pipeline of new home construction for their livelihoods. The number of jobs in American construction dwarfs the number of jobs in American lumber production by an enormous margin. For every job that is theoretically protected in a domestic lumber mill by a tariff, multiple jobs in construction are threatened by the higher costs that tariff creates. The tariff destroys more employment than it protects. Mathematically, structurally, inevitably. And then there is the housing shortage dimension, because this is happening at exactly the wrong moment. The United States is facing a severe housing shortage. This is not a controversial claim. Estimates from economists across the political spectrum suggest that the country needs to build between 4 and 7 million additional housing units just to meet existing demand and restore some semblance of affordability to the market. 4 to 7 million units. That is the scale of the deficit. That is how far behind American housing construction has fallen relative to population growth, household formation, and decades of underbuilding. Closing that gap requires a massive, sustained, years-long construction program. Enormous volumes of lumber. Tens of millions of board feet flowing into construction projects across every state in the country. And Trump's tariffs have made every single one of those units more expensive to build. When building costs rise, projects that were marginally viable become unviable. Developers who were planning to build affordable housing units, already the hardest category to make work financially, find their numbers no longer pencil. They cancel projects. They downsize. They shift toward higher-end units where wider margins can absorb higher costs. The people who pay the price for this are the families who needed those affordable units. The working families. The teachers and nurses and warehouse workers and first responders who live in the cities where they work and cannot afford the rising rents because not enough housing was built. Tariffs that raise construction costs do not just make individual homes more expensive. They make the housing shortage worse. They make rental markets tighter. They accelerate the divergence between what housing costs and what ordinary families earn. This is not a side effect of the tariff policy. It is a direct, predictable, structural consequence. And it was predictable before the tariffs were imposed. The market structure was not a secret. Let me be very precise about the financial architecture of this tariff. Because understanding who benefits and who pays tells you everything about why this policy exists despite the damage it causes. When an American home builder imports Canadian lumber and pays a 35% tariff, that tariff payment goes to the United States Treasury. The money goes to the government. The builder does not receive any relief. The Canadian producer does not keep it. It goes to Washington. The builder recovers that cost by charging more for the finished home. The cost passes through. The home buyer pays the higher price. The family trying to buy its first house. The couple trying to upgrade to accommodate children. The retiree trying to downsize. They pay the tariff, indirectly, through a higher purchase price. So follow the money one more time. The government gains revenue. Canadian producers lose market share as volumes decline. American consumers pay higher prices. American construction workers face reduced employment. This is not trade protection. This is taxation disguised as trade policy. The government is collecting a tax from American home buyers, running it through lumber import paperwork, and calling it protection of American industry. The American lumber industry receives some benefit from reduced competition. But the cost of that benefit is paid entirely by the American consumers who need homes. Now let me show you who has the political power in this equation. Because that is the part that explains why this keeps happening. The United States and Canada have been fighting over softwood lumber for over 40 years. 40 years. Think about that. This is not a new dispute. This is not something that emerged from Trump's trade philosophy. This is a recurring cycle that has repeated itself over and over again across multiple presidencies, multiple trade agreements, and multiple supposedly final resolutions. Each round follows the same pattern. The American domestic lumber industry, concentrated in specific states and congressional districts, employing tens of thousands of workers who vote and whose employers donate to political campaigns, lobbies for tariffs. Politicians respond. Tariffs get imposed. Canada challenges them through trade dispute mechanisms. Years of legal proceedings follow. Sometimes a negotiated agreement emerges. It holds for a few years. And then the cycle starts again. The Section 232 national security justification is simply the latest legal mechanism for imposing tariffs that trade agreements would otherwise prohibit. The Canada-United States-Mexico agreement limits tariffs on most goods. But national security exceptions exist in almost every trade agreement ever negotiated. Section 232 is the key that unlocks that exception. The Commerce Department conducts an investigation. The President receives a report. A proclamation gets issued. Tariffs take effect. The entire process bypasses the normal dispute resolution mechanisms that trade agreements are designed to provide. Canada can challenge the tariffs through arbitration. That challenge is ongoing. But arbitration takes years. And while it proceeds, the tariffs remain in place. American builders pay higher costs. Canadian producers face reduced competitiveness. And the underlying dispute that has been unresolved for 4 decades remains unresolved. The political calculus is straightforward and cynical. Domestic lumber producers employ tens of thousands of workers concentrated in specific regions. Those workers vote in specific congressional districts. Their employers have political relationships with specific representatives and senators. The political return on protecting that industry is concentrated and visible. The political cost is diffuse. Millions of home buyers paying slightly more for their homes. Millions of renters facing higher rents because fewer affordable units get built. Millions of construction workers whose employment is marginally less stable. None of these groups organize around lumber tariffs specifically. None of them show up at campaign events demanding relief from softwood import duties. They just pay more and wonder why housing got so expensive. That asymmetry, concentrated political benefits, diffuse political costs, is why bad trade policy persists for decades. It is not stupidity. It is a rational response to political incentives that are structurally misaligned with economic outcomes. Now let us look at what Canada can actually do about this. Because the options are more limited than most people realize, and understanding the constraints helps you see why this dispute has lasted 40 years without resolution. Option 1. Retaliatory tariffs on American goods. Canada could impose tariffs on American exports in response. It has done this in past disputes. The problem is that retaliatory tariffs harm Canadian consumers by making American imports more expensive. Canada is a smaller economy than the United States. A trade war hurts Canada proportionally more than it hurts America. And retaliatory tariffs do not actually help Canadian lumber producers, they just spread the economic damage more broadly. Option 2. Legal challenges under the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement. This is happening. Canada has filed challenges through the dispute resolution process established under the trade agreement. But as I mentioned, those processes take years. The legal mechanisms move slowly by design. And while they proceed, the tariffs remain in force and the economic damage accumulates. Option 3. Negotiate a new softwood lumber agreement. This has been tried repeatedly. The two countries have negotiated multiple softwood lumber agreements over the decades. Some have held for significant periods. But they have never produced a permanent resolution because the underlying dispute, whether Canadian provincial forest management practices constitute an unfair subsidy, has never been definitively resolved to both sides' satisfaction. There is no quick option. There is no lever that Canada can pull to make the tariffs disappear next month or next quarter. The structural reality is that the United States holds most of the leverage in this relationship, not because Canada is weak, but because the United States is a much larger economy and American demand for Canadian lumber is worth more to Canada than Canadian lumber supply is worth to the United States. This asymmetry is uncomfortable to state plainly. But it is the reality that shapes every negotiation and every response. What Canada can do, and what it is doing, is making the costs of the tariff policy visible to the American stakeholders who are actually paying them. Organizations like the National Association of Home Builders are doing that work when they publish the $9,000 figure. Every time that number appears in a news story, every time an American family reads it and connects it to their experience of being priced out of homeownership, Canada's position in this dispute becomes a little stronger. The political cost of the tariff becomes more visible. And in American politics, visible costs eventually produce political responses. The lumber situation does not exist in isolation. It is one example of a pattern that has repeated itself across every major sector where Trump has imposed tariffs. And seeing the pattern makes the predictability of the damage even more stark. Trump imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum. American manufacturers who use steel and aluminum as inputs, the auto industry, the appliance industry, the construction equipment industry, faced higher production costs. Some passed costs to consumers. Some absorbed costs through reduced margins. Some relocated production to avoid the tariffs. The steel and aluminum industries gained protection. The much larger industries downstream paid more. Trump imposed tariffs on solar panels. American solar installers, companies trying to build out renewable energy capacity, creating installation jobs across the country, faced higher equipment costs. The pace of solar deployment slowed. Clean energy jobs in installation were lost or never created. The small domestic panel manufacturing industry gained some protection. The much larger installation industry paid more. Trump imposed tariffs on washing machines. Whirlpool, the American manufacturer that lobbied for those tariffs, saw some benefit in reduced competition. American consumers paid an estimated $86 more per washing machine. The Federal Reserve studied the washing machine tariff specifically and found they created about 1,700 jobs in appliance manufacturing, while costing American consumers approximately $1,500 per job created. The consumers paid more per job than the workers earned. Trump imposed tariffs on lumber. American builders pay $9,000 more per home. Housing affordability worsens. The housing shortage deepens. Construction employment faces headwinds. In every case, the same structural reality plays out. Tariffs work when domestic industries can expand to fill the supply gap created by making imports more expensive. When that capacity exists, tariffs can genuinely redirect demand to domestic production and create or protect jobs. But when domestic capacity cannot expand, because of resource constraints, regulatory limits, growth cycles, or decades of structural decline, tariffs simply make the imported good more expensive. They do not create the alternative supply. They just raise the price of the supply that already exists. American lumber production cannot expand quickly. The forests grow on their own schedule. The mills that closed in the Pacific Northwest will not reopen because a tariff proclamation made Canadian lumber 35% more expensive. The workers who left the industry have built other careers. The constraint is real. The tariff is indifferent to that reality. And American home buyers pay the difference. Let me bring this down to the level of individual families. Because policy discussions can become abstract, and the $9,000 number can start to feel like just a number rather than what it actually is, a barrier standing between millions of American families and the homes they are trying to build or buy. Think about the young couple who has been saving for 5 years. They have watched housing prices rise faster than their incomes for years. They have made sacrifices, delayed vacations, driven older cars, lived in apartments smaller than they wanted, in order to accumulate the down payment they need. They finally have enough. They start looking at new construction. They find a development that fits their budget, barely, but it fits. And then the builder tells them the price has gone up. $9,000 more than the listing showed when they first inquired. Because lumber costs are up. Because the tariff landed. $9,000. To a family that was already at the edge of what they could afford. That is the difference between buying and not buying. That is the difference between building equity and continuing to rent. That is the difference between the stability of homeownership and another year of rising rents and uncertainty. Now multiply that couple by the millions of American families in similar situations. Millions of people for whom that $9,000 barrier is the margin between achievable and impossible. That is the human cost of a tariff that was sold as protecting American workers. And then there are the renters. Every family that cannot afford to buy a home becomes a renter. Every renter adds demand to a rental market that is already tight because not enough homes have been built. Every additional renter pushes rents higher for everyone else in that market. The damage radiates outward. The tariff hits the lumber. The lumber cost hits the builder. The builder cost hits the buyer. The buyer who cannot afford becomes the renter. The renter's demand hits the rental market. The rental market's tightness hits everyone who rents. This is what economists call a cascade. And tariffs on essential construction materials create cascades that touch virtually every segment of the housing market. So if tariffs are not the answer, what is? I want to be clear that this is not a simple question with a simple answer. The structural challenges in American lumber production are real. The desire to reduce dependence on a single foreign supplier for a critical construction material is legitimate. The policy goal of strengthening American industrial capacity is not inherently wrong. The problem is not the goal. The problem is using tariffs as the instrument to achieve a goal that tariffs structurally cannot achieve. If the United States genuinely wants to reduce its dependence on Canadian lumber over time, The path forward involves things that take decades and cost real money up front. Reforming federal forest management policy to allow more sustainable timber harvesting on federal lands in the Pacific Northwest, while maintaining the environmental protections that matter, could gradually increase domestic supply over years. This is a legitimate policy debate that involves real trade-offs. Investing in mill construction and modernization in regions where forest resources exist could increase processing capacity. This requires capital, workforce development, and infrastructure investment. Funding research into alternative building materials, engineered wood products, mass timber, materials that use different species or faster-growing wood, could reduce the dependence on specific species over time. Negotiating a stable, long-term softwood lumber agreement with Canada that provides predictable market access on both sides, rather than the 40-year cycle of tariffs, disputes, agreements, and more tariffs, could stabilize the market and give both sides a foundation to plan around. None of these solutions produces results in a news cycle. None of them make for a strong proclamation. None of them give a president something dramatic to announce. But all of them actually address the underlying problem, rather than simply making it more expensive to live with. Let me leave you with this. Trump promised tariffs would protect American industry. In the lumber market, they did not protect anything except the political relationships between the domestic lumber lobby and the politicians who depend on their support. What the tariffs actually did is add $9,000 to the cost of building an American home, at the exact moment when millions of American families desperately need more homes to be built. 85% of the softwood lumber used in American construction comes from Canada. That is not a choice. It is a structural reality shaped by decades of forest policy, environmental decisions, and market development. It cannot be changed by a proclamation. It cannot be reversed by a tariff. It can only be addressed through investments and policy changes that take years or decades to produce results. Meanwhile, American builders are paying the price. American home buyers are paying the price. American renters are paying the price. The housing shortage is deeper. Affordability is worse. And the 40-year dispute that produced this situation is no closer to resolution than it was when it started. This is what happens when trade policy serves political interests instead of economic reality. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of what is actually happening in the lumber market and in the broader housing crisis, share this video right now. Send it to someone who is trying to understand why homes have gotten so expensive. Post it to someone arguing about tariffs. Because this is exactly the kind of concrete, specific example that makes abstract trade policy debates real. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Tell me, do you think American lumber production could realistically scale up to replace Canadian supply? Do you think the 40-year cycle of this dispute will ever end? What do you think it would actually take to build enough homes to address the shortage? Like this video if it gave you something valuable. Subscribe to Inside Canada for more analysis that goes beyond the headlines and into the actual structure of what is happening between these two countries. Hit the bell so you never miss a breakdown. Because this story, the story of two economies so deeply integrated that tariffs designed to push them apart end up hurting the country that imposed them, is not ending anytime soon. I will see you in the next one.